Alien Professor Zarek loomed over the vast auditorium, his 6 luminous eyes sweeping across the assembled students from dozens of species. The room hummed with anticipation, a low murmur of alien dialects and flickering bioluminescent signals. Today was the day of the legendary 24-hour cognition trial, an exam so notoriously difficult that even the finest scholars of the Zyphorian Galactic Academy barely managed to finish it within the allotted time. The challenge, Zarek intoned, his deep, reverberating voice silencing the hall, is the true measure of intellect among the finest minds in the known galaxy. It has broken many, humbled more, and crowned only a select few with academic immortality. The students, an eclectic mix of reptilian scholars, cephalopod intellectuals, and silicon-based savants, listened with reverence. No one had ever completed the test in less than 20 hours. Even the most brilliant minds found themselves gasping in exhaustion by the end, their neural networks overloaded with the test's brutal complexity. At the back of the hall, sitting lazily with his feet propped up on the chair in front of him, was Ethan Carter. He was the only human in the room, an exchange student from Earth, and judging by the way he was chewing on a protein bar, he was also the only one completely uninterested in the speech. A tall, insectoid student named RYK Toll noticed him and let out a chittering laugh. The primate doesn't understand what's happening. Do they even have higher education on that backwater world of his? A ripple of quiet amusement spread through the room. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic academic scene, and while they had made an impression in certain fields, no one expected them to be capable of matching the intellectual giants of the cosmos. Ethan finally stretched, sighed, and raised a hand. "Hey, Professor Zarek. Any rule against finishing early?" The room fell silent. Every alien present turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from disbelief to mild irritation. Zarek's gaze locked onto Ethan, his facial tendrils curling slightly in what passed for skepticism. "There is no restriction on time, only completion," Zarek said slowly. "However, if you are suggesting you might finish ahead of schedule, I must caution you, every student here has studied for years to attempt this challenge. It is not something to be taken lightly." Ethan shrugged. "Just curious." The professor said nothing more, merely gestured toward the projection screen. The exam materialized in shimmering holographic text before each student, a labyrinth of mathematical theorems, logic puzzles, and abstract pattern recognition sequences so complex that even the most advanced AI constructs struggled to parse them in a reasonable time frame. Pens scratched. Clawed fingers tapped feverishly on interfaces. Nervous glances shot around the room as alien minds pushed themselves to their limits. The test had begun. Ethan, meanwhile, leaned forward, scanned the first question, and chuckled softly. "Oh," he muttered under his breath. "It's just that? This is high school level." He picked up his stylus and, without hesitation, started writing. His hand moved swiftly, weaving through the equations with practiced ease. Unlike the aliens, who relied on their species' specialized thought processes, hyperlogical structures, memory indexing, multi-threaded reasoning, Ethan relied on something entirely different. Pattern recognition. Instinct. A lifetime of puzzle solving, honed by everything from childhood brain teasers to Earth's notorious culture of speed-solving competitions. 10 minutes passed. Ethan reached the halfway mark. The alien students were still grinding through the opening sections, already feeling the mental strain. Zarek observed from his podium, his eyes flicking toward Ethan's interface. At first, he dismissed the rapid progress as careless guessing, until he noticed something strange. Ethan wasn't hesitating. He wasn't erasing or correcting his work. Every answer flowed naturally, smoothly, as if he had already solved these problems in his head before even writing them down. 15 minutes. Ethan was 3/4 finished. By the 20-minute mark, the whispers began. "Impossible," a deep-voiced reptilian muttered, his scales flaring in agitation. "He's not even slowing down." What if he's actually solving it?" another alien murmured, their bioluminescent skin flashing erratically in disbelief. Professor Zarek clenched his tendrils, watching as Ethan penned his final answer with a flourish, stretched again, and yawned. Then, without any sign of hesitation, he stood up, grabbed his tablet, and walked toward the submission portal at the front of the room. The moment he pressed the confirmation button, the room fell into stunned silence. 30 minutes. Every eye turned toward him as he casually slid his hands into his pockets and turned toward the professor. "All right," Ethan said with a smirk. "I'm done." Professor Zarek stared at the human as if he had just witnessed an asteroid reversing its trajectory mid-flight. Around the auditorium, murmurs turned into a cacophony of disbelief, confusion, and, in some cases, outright laughter. The very idea of someone finishing the 24-hour cognition trial in 30 minutes was beyond absurd. It was impossible. And yet, Ethan Carter stood there, arms crossed, looking as if he had just turned in a routine homework assignment. The professor's tendrils twitched slightly, an involuntary response of uncertainty. He had taught for over 3 centuries at the Zyphorian Galactic Academy, overseeing some of the greatest minds the galaxy had ever produced. He had personally watched geniuses collapse under the weight of this challenge, their mental faculties drained by the sheer intricacy of the problems. "Mr. Carter," Zarek said, his voice measured, "I assume this is a joke." Ethan blinked. "Nope." More hushed murmurs. One of the assistants, a pale-skinned Vorthian with elongated fingers, stepped forward, glancing at the tablet in Ethan's hand as if it might contain an error. "Sir," the assistant muttered to Zarek. "The system has accepted his submission. It is fully completed." That was when the tension in the room truly shifted. A few students who had barely scratched the surface of the test turned to look at Ethan with wide, disbelieving eyes. Some of the more competitive ones, like the insectoid RYK Toll, hissed in irritation. "There is no way a human did this correctly," RYK Toll snapped, his mandibles clicking furiously. "Check his work. He must have guessed, copied, or—" "There is no way to copy," Professor Zarek interrupted. His voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable weight. "Every student receives a uniquely generated version of the trial, tailored specifically to their cognitive abilities. The system prevents duplication." That statement sent another wave of confusion through the hall. "So, that means," a reptilian student rasped, glancing between Ethan and the professor. "That means, assuming his answers are correct," Zarek murmured, his gaze now locked onto Ethan with something between wariness and fascination. "He didn't just pass. He may have obliterated the test." A hush fell over the students as the professor gestured toward one of the data interfaces. The assistant, still looking hesitant, pressed a command, and Ethan's answers materialized in glowing holographic form. The entire test, from the first equation to the last, lay before them in pristine, perfectly structured completion. Zarek's eyes darted across the solutions, his trained mind analyzing the methodology, the approach, the execution. And with each passing second, his skepticism morphed into something else. It was flawless. More than flawless, it was elegant. Some of the problems in the trial required laborious calculations spanning dozens of steps. Ethan had found shortcuts, backdoor solutions that bypassed entire sequences of work. Some of his answers weren't just correct, they were more efficient than the best solutions ever recorded. For the first time in a very long career, Professor Zarek felt something he had not experienced in decades. Genuine shock. He began, but for once, words failed him. Ethan simply grinned. Was it supposed to be harder? That set off an eruption of reactions. Some students laughed nervously, others seethed, and a few looked genuinely concerned, as if the human had just revealed himself to be something other than what they had assumed. RYK Toll, still seething, jabbed a clawed finger at Ethan. "There's no way you solved it that fast. Humans don't have the cognitive complexity for this. What did you do? Memorize all possible variations?" Ethan scratched his chin, considering his words. "Not exactly." Professor Zarek straightened, his scholarly instincts overriding his initial shock. "Then how? Explain your methodology." Ethan shrugged. "Pattern recognition." A pause. Some students exchanged confused glances, but Zarek leaned forward slightly. "Clarify," he said. Ethan gestured vaguely at the glowing equations in the air. See, you guys tend to brute force your way through these problems. Logical pathways, multi-threaded thought structures, systemized reasoning. All great stuff, but kind of slow. That earned a few murmurs of irritation, but Ethan continued. Humans, at least the good ones, don't just analyze problems. We feel them. We recognize patterns, intuit connections, make leaps that technically shouldn't be possible. He tapped the first equation. This one? It's just a Fibonacci variant hidden in base 8 notation. I've seen similar ones before. He moved to the next. This is a chaotic prime expansion. It looked complicated, but if you map it against a simple two-dimensional matrix, the pattern jumps right out. One by one, he walked through his solutions, not in the slow, laborious way an alien would, but in the rapid, intuitive manner of a human who saw the answer before he even consciously processed the steps. By the time he finished, even the most skeptical students had fallen silent. Zarek, for all his years of expertise, exhaled deeply. Fascinating, he murmured. I had not considered such an approach. Ethan rocked back on his heels. Yeah, well, that's the thing about humans. We tend to look at the whole picture, not just the pieces. The professor remained silent for several long moments. Then, an emotion so slow it was almost imperceptible, he turned toward his assistant. Verify his results. The assistant, pale-faced, pressed the necessary commands. The room collectively held its breath as the system processed Ethan's answers, cross-referencing them against known solutions. And then, a single tone chimed. The system displayed a message in cold, undeniable letters. Perfect score. Record time. Silence. Then, all at once, the entire room erupted. The auditorium had devolved into a maelstrom of chaos. Students chittered, hissed, and spoke over one another in a dozen different languages, their bioluminescent displays flickering wildly with shock, confusion, and, among some, outright disbelief. A perfect score. In record time. Professor Zarek stood motionless, his tendrils slowly coiling in thought. He had expected disbelief, anger, even suspicion of fraud. What he had not expected was to be staring at something so profoundly unprecedented that it threatened the very foundation of their academic traditions. Ethan Carter remained remarkably unimpressed. He watched the commotion with mild amusement, arms crossed, as if he had just finished an easy quiz in elementary school rather than rewriting the hierarchy of the galaxy's intellectual elite. This is a mistake. R.Y.K. Toll, the insectoid student, hissed. The system must be malfunctioning. No human, no one, could have solved the trial like that. One of the assistant professors, a towering, crystalline being named Vaylor, cleared their throat, a sound like wind chimes rattling in a storm. We have already verified the results. The probability of system error is less than 1 in 10 trillion. Zarek's gaze didn't leave Ethan. Then there is only one explanation, he said. Mr. Carter, you possess a cognitive methodology that has eluded our understanding. Ethan smirked. You could just say I'm smart. The tension in the room thickened. Some of the students bristled at what they perceived as arrogance, while others looked at Ethan with something approaching fear. If a single human could do this, what did it mean for the rest of his species? Professor Zarek ignored the murmurs. His mind was already working through the implications. Zyphorian Galactic Academy had operated under the assumption that the most powerful intellects in the universe belonged to the oldest, most biologically advanced species. Their methodologies, though different in form, had always shared common constraints: strict logic, sequential processing, methodical analysis. And now this human had solved the trial in ways they had never even considered. How? Zarek finally asked. Explain. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I get it. You guys are used to thinking in one way. You build these problems assuming everyone has to grind their way through them. Step by step, meticulously mapping every possibility. He gestured toward the holographic display still floating above the room. Humans, we don't always do that. We use something else, intuition. Intuition? Vaylor echoed, their crystalline bodies pulsing with uncertainty. Ethan nodded. Pattern recognition. Gut instincts. We're wired to see solutions before we even fully understand how we got there. Instead of breaking the problem down into a million little steps, we jump ahead. It's not that we're ignoring logic, it's that we process it differently. Faster. Zarek's eyes narrowed. That should not be possible. Ethan chuckled. Tell that to every chess grandmaster on my planet who can make 20-move calculations in their heads. Or the engineers who build machines faster than your AI predictions. Or the musicians who can hear a melody once and replicate it perfectly. A sharp, uneasy silence followed. The room of alien scholars was beginning to understand something terrifying. Humans didn't just think differently. They thought faster. More unpredictably. More creatively. Vaylor hesitated. That's an evolutionarily dangerous trait. Ethan's smile widened. You have no idea. Zarek's tendrils twitched again, this time in something resembling unease. If what this human was saying was true, if his species truly possessed this kind of cognitive adaptability, then it was no wonder humanity had risen so fast in the galactic community. It wasn't brute strength, nor superior technology. It was sheer mental agility. And that was far more terrifying than any warship. I must test this further, Zarek said, his voice suddenly resolute. He turned to his assistants. Prepare the Omega problem. A fresh wave of whispers flooded the room. The Omega problem was not just any challenge, it was a mathematical paradox, an equation so complex that no species, no AI, no entity in known history had ever solved it. It was a theoretical construct, a test of raw intellectual power, a problem that had stood unsolved for over 2,000 years. Ethan tilted his head. Huh. Sounds fun. Zarek stared at him. You do not comprehend its difficulty. Ethan shrugged. Let's see if I can figure it out before lunch. The moment the problem appeared on the holographic display, the entire auditorium leaned in. The equation stretched impossibly long, its variables twisting in dimensions beyond physical space, a mess of quantum fluctuations and recursive paradoxes. For a moment, there was silence. Then Ethan let out a small, amused sound. Oh, he muttered. That's what this is? You guys have been stuck on this for 2,000 years? Zarek's tendrils froze. You recognize it? Ethan nodded, already pulling out his stylus. Yeah. You've been looking at it wrong. This isn't an equation, it's a fractal algorithm disguised as one. And someone made a mistake in the third recursion layer. Every scholar in the room went still. What? Vaylor's voice barely registered above a whisper. Ethan was already writing. His hand moved faster than should have been possible, his strokes confident, casual, absolutely certain. As though he weren't solving an unsolvable paradox, just fixing a typo. 5 minutes later, he set his stylus down. There, he said, stretching. That should do it. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the system chimed. Answer verified. Zarek staggered. Ethan leaned back, cracking his knuckles. Took a little longer than I thought. Guess I'm getting slow. Silence. Then, pandemonium. The moment the verification chime echoed through the auditorium, the entire room seemed to freeze in time. It was as if reality itself had hiccuped, stalled, before shattering into utter pandemonium. Professor Zarek stood utterly motionless, his tendrils so still they might have been carved from stone. Vaylor, the crystalline scholar, had ceased glowing entirely, a rare phenomenon among their species that indicated a complete neural crash. And the students? They erupted. Shouts, frantic whispers, arguments in a dozen alien dialects filled the air. Some students were already pulling up secondary interfaces, desperately running simulations to understand what had just happened. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how a human, of all beings, had just cracked the unsolvable. RYK Toll, the insectoid, slammed a claw against the table. "This is impossible," he snarled. "No single mind, no species, should be able to process the omega problem in mere minutes. It's been a mathematical paradox for 2,000 years," Ethan finished, stretching his arms. "Yeah, you guys mentioned that." RYK Toll's mandibles clicked furiously. "Then explain it, primate." Ethan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Look, I don't want to be that guy, but your entire approach to the problem was, well, wrong." He gestured toward the holographic display, where the once impossible equation now sat neatly solved, its cascading figures resolved into perfect symmetry. "You all kept treating this like a traditional equation. A solvable set of variables, with a definite solution. But that's not what it was. This was a fractal-based algorithm, recursively shifting its own constraints with every attempt to solve it. Every species that worked on it was just chasing their own tails." Zarek's voice, when it finally came, was quiet. "And you saw this immediately?" Ethan shrugged. "Took me a second. The mistake was obvious." Vaylor finally managed to regain their composure. "A mistake? You mean, someone miscalculated the omega problem's foundational structure?" Ethan nodded. "Yep. The third recursion layer wasn't actually paradoxical. Whoever first documented the problem made a simple miscalculation that self-propagated across every attempted solution. The whole thing was an illusion. A trick of bad initial data. Once I recognized the pattern, it was just a matter of, well, cleaning up the mess." Silence stretched for a long, painful moment. A mistake. For 2,000 years, the greatest minds in the galaxy had battled an error. A ghost in the equation. Something a single human had seen through in minutes. Zarek slowly turned toward his assistant. "Run the model." The assistant's hands shook as they input the revised dataset, using Ethan's corrected sequence. A few tense seconds passed. Then the system processed the update, streaming it live to every connected academic institution across the galaxy. And the moment the model completed its run, the results were indisputable. For the first time in recorded history, the omega problem had a verified solution. A shiver ran through the room as the implications sank in. This wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was a paradigm shift. The omega problem's resolution meant that thousands of fields, quantum physics, time dilation mechanics, computational AI, would need to be completely reevaluated. Some of the fundamental theories underpinning modern galactic science had just been rewritten in a matter of minutes. By a human. RYK Toll collapsed into his seat, shaking. This changes everything." Vaylor's bioluminescent body pulsed rapidly, flashing through colors Ethan didn't recognize. If humans can perceive these kinds of errors instinctively, then their cognitive abilities may surpass anything we ever accounted for. Professor Zarek inhaled deeply. The tension in his body finally eased, not in relief, but in the slow, dawning comprehension of what he was witnessing. Humanity had been underestimated. Gravely. And now, the entire galaxy was about to find out just how far behind they really were. Zarek straightened, his voice regaining its measured calm. "Mr. Carter." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" "I request," the professor said slowly, carefully, "that you accompany me to the Academy's High Council." Ethan's smirk faded slightly. "That sounds official." "It is." Zarek's gaze was unreadable. "We must reevaluate Earth's status within the galactic academic order. Immediately." Ethan looked at the stunned faces around him, the alien students still grappling with what had just transpired. The weight of it all settled in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about humanity. And the entire galaxy had just realized they were playing catch-up. Ethan exhaled, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Well," he muttered, "guess I better dress nice." The news spread like a solar flare ripping through the galactic network. By the time Ethan stepped into the towering halls of the Zyphorian Galactic Academy's High Council chamber, his name had already reached the farthest corners of known space. His human face, was plastered across news streams and academic journals, debated in research forums, and scrutinized by scholars who, mere hours ago, hadn't even considered his species as anything but average. Now, Ethan Carter was either the most dangerous mind in the galaxy or the greatest intellectual breakthrough in centuries. The chamber was vast, its ceilings so high they disappeared into luminescent mist. The curved walls were lined with holoscreens displaying data streams, academic projections, and Ethan's recent obliteration of the Omega problem. And at the center, sitting in a crescent formation, were the high scholars of the Xiphorian academic order, representatives from the most intellectually dominant species in the galaxy. At least, they had been dominant. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, some calculating, some wary, a few outright hostile. The old order was shifting under their feet, and they didn't like it. Professor Zarek stood beside him, his usual authoritative presence now tinged with something more cautious. For all his admiration of Ethan's mind, he was a scholar first, a being who had spent centuries believing in the hierarchy of intelligence. Today, that hierarchy had collapsed. A Vorthian elder, her translucent skin shimmering with contained agitation, finally broke the silence. "We have confirmed the results," she said, her voice smooth and precise. "Ethan Carter has, in fact, solved the Omega problem. With complete accuracy. In minutes." Another council member, a bulky, stone-skinned Chironian, leaned forward. His voice rumbled like shifting tectonic plates. "Do we even know if he's telling the truth about how he did it? Perhaps humans have some artificial assistance, a cognitive augmentation we have not accounted for." Ethan snorted. "If you think I've got some superbrain implant, I've got some bad news for you." "Then explain," the Vorthian elder pressed. "How is your species capable of such advanced problem-solving? We have never encountered cognition like this." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "It's not how humans think differently, it's why." Silence. He gestured toward the massive holoscreen displaying his solution to the Omega problem. "You all evolved in structured, stable environments. Your civilizations mastered logic, expanded knowledge, built on centuries of established learning. You follow the rules of thought. Methodical. Calculated." He turned to face them fully. "Humans? We don't have that luxury. We're a species that survived, not by following rules, but by breaking them. We adapted, improvised, found shortcuts. Our evolution rewarded lateral thinking, because the ones who hesitated, the ones who followed the step-by-step manual, died." A slow ripple of unease passed through the council. "We don't just analyze problems," Ethan continued. "We jump ahead. We see solutions before we even understand them. You called it intuition, but really, it's an algorithm of survival." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That's why your brightest mind spent 2,000 years failing, and I saw the answer in 5 minutes." Zarek watched the council closely. Some were nodding, reluctantly absorbing the implications. Others looked, afraid. The Chironian counselor rumbled, "Then that makes humanity the most unpredictable intelligence the galaxy has ever encountered." Ethan tilted his head. "I mean, yeah. Kind of our thing." The murmurs of debate resumed, but now there was a different tone. This wasn't just about Ethan's test scores anymore. This was about power. For millennia, the galactic academic order had dictated who shaped knowledge, who advanced science, who wielded the intellectual high ground. But now, humanity had just torn through their greatest intellectual barrier like it was nothing. And in a universe where intelligence meant influence, humanity had just changed the game. The Vorthian elder exhaled slowly. "Earth's academic status will have to be reassessed. Immediately." Zarek's tendrils twitched in approval. "Agreed." The Chironian counselor narrowed his stone-like eyes at Ethan. "And you, human, what do you want from this?" Ethan exhaled, glancing at the massive chamber, the sea of nervous scholars. He hadn't really thought about that. He'd only come here as an exchange student, hoping for a decent education. But now? Now, he had the entire galactic intellectual order on edge. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face. "Let's start with a faculty position," he said. "I think it's time the Academy learned how humans really think." The council fell into stunned silence. And then, against all odds, Zarek smiled. The High Council chamber had never been so silent. Not in all its centuries of existence. Ethan's words hung in the air like a gravitational anomaly, impossible, undeniable, and completely disruptive to the status quo. A human, a species that most of these scholars had barely considered noteworthy, was standing before them demanding a faculty position at the most prestigious academic institution in the galaxy. And worse, he had earned it. Zarek, still composed but clearly intrigued, turned his many-eyed gaze toward the council. A human professor at the Xiphorian Galactic Academy, it would be an unprecedented appointment. Valor, the crystalline scholar, shifted uncomfortably. It would also send a message we are not prepared for. The Vorthian elder nodded gravely. If we acknowledge this request, we are acknowledging that our academic hierarchy has been flawed. Ethan leaned forward slightly. You mean acknowledging that you've been wrong about humanity? A ripple of tension passed through the assembled scholars. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. For centuries, they had classified humanity as an emerging species, bright but limited, innovative but undisciplined. They had dismissed them as mere adapters, not pioneers. And now, one human had ripped apart that assumption in less than a day. The Chironian scholar's voice rumbled with reluctance. If we grant this position, we must consider the larger implications. If a human can outperform our brightest minds, what else have we overlooked? Ethan smirked. Glad you're finally asking the right question. Zarek exhaled, his tendrils flexing in a way that suggested deep thought. He turned back to Ethan. You have overturned centuries of established belief in a matter of hours. If we accept your request, you will not just be a professor, Ethan Carter. You will be the professor who represents an entirely new paradigm. Ethan crossed his arms. I can live with that. The scholars exchanged long, measured glances. This was more than a faculty appointment. It was a reckoning, a recognition that humanity was not only an intellectual equal, but perhaps a species capable of surpassing them all. Finally, the Vorthian elder straightened, her translucent form shimmering in quiet resignation. All in favor of granting Ethan Carter a faculty position at the Xiphorian Galactic Academy, she said. One by one, the council members hesitated, then slowly raised their hands. The Chironian was the last to do so, his stone-like expression unreadable. Zarek turned to Ethan. Then it is decided. You are now Professor Carter of the Xiphorian Galactic Academy. The room was still tense, but Ethan could sense the inevitable shift beneath it all. The old order was gone. The game had changed. And now, the galaxy had to decide how to deal with a species they had underestimated for far too long. Ethan rocked back on his heels, a grin tugging at his lips. Cool. So when do I get in office? A few scholars looked personally offended by his casual tone, but Zarek merely shook his head, something eerily close to amusement flashing in his many eyes. We will arrange accommodations. As Ethan turned to leave, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing against him. The stares. The questions. The fear. This was bigger than him now. Because the moment he walked out of that room, humanity was no longer just a participant in the galactic intellectual order. They were a force to be reckoned with. And the universe had no idea what was coming next.